Hi, thanks for joining us for the third episode of Icon Minds. I'm here with Jamie Fobert at ARPA, who are our partners for this series. Thank you so much for joining me here today, Jamie.
Oh, you're welcome.
We're here to discuss the subject of the future of the city. I was wondering, in an era of kind of urban population growth, how you think architects can respond to the issue of the housing crisis?
Well, I think our own personal experience of working in the city has been one of mainly working within existing fabric, about being able to weave between existing buildings and to find opportunities in the city as it stands. And it's an additive process. It's quite one of incision and of finding ways to make new spaces from old. We're not very interested in large-scale demolition and creation of new big housing developments. Personally, I find that they can be incredibly sterile, but I know that it's a model that developers prefer. But I think there's much more intuitive and gentle ways of creating spaces in cities and allowing densification to take place. I think cities can be dense. I think personally I enjoy the density of the city, and I think the density of city allows for the city to have a really rich cultural life and a rich social life, and those two things are combined with density. I've always been a city dweller. I love cities, so I don't have a problem with densification.
Are there any particular kind of urban architectural projects that you've taken on in which you've been involved in, not the urban planning, but in engaging with the wider city?
Well, it wasn't housing and it wasn't densification in that way, but I think we spent 14 years working in St. Ives in Cornwall with a project to extend the Tate Gallery there. And what we learned in that period was about community in a way which I'd never engaged with community before. And in the process of listening to a community and of reacting to what we found, what we learned from spending time in it's a town of 10,000 people. It's quite small. It's incredibly idiosyncratic piece of architectural city town making. It's a really beautiful piece of city.
Why did it take 14 years?
Well, the Tate Gallery was the largest building in the town by far. Wow. And so when it was announced that the Tate were hoping to double it in size, there was an immediate reaction from the townspeople against the idea of this London institution sort of taking over their town, which was not the intention of Tate or Cornwall County Council at all. But it was a process of allowing the community to voice their concerns. And then we stepped back from doing the first project, and we spent 5 years making a series of studies and then taking those to the town and allowing the town to absorb what options there were. And in the end, the town came back to the idea of extending the existing building. But we had learned so much in that process that we understood that for a number of reasons, to sink the gallery into the hillside and making it level with the existing gallery just was the right solution. And it allowed us to make a public garden on its roof. It allowed us to make a staircase, which allowed people to get from the top of the town to the beach. Mm-hmm. It became, in a way, a gift from the Tate to the town rather than something imposed on the town. And
what you opted for, conversely to sort of iconic cultural institutions that are often commissioned for architects to create. Instead, you created a structure that is mainly invisible from the outside. What drove you to build the extension in that way?
I think in almost all of our projects, I tend to be more interested in creating an architecture of internal spaces. I'm really not interested in these iconic forms with whatever use is necessary sort of shoved into them. It's not an architecture that is about creating iconic buildings that speak more about the ego of the architect than they speak about anything else. We're much more interested in creating really emotive pieces of architecture that have great internal presence. And they do have external presence at times, but that's not our priority.
And was that because you were working in a relatively small town, or is it something you would propose even for a cultural institution in, say, London?
But it's something which has occurred naturally over time in many of our projects. So the first house that we ever built was hidden in the center of a block and could only exploit top light. It had no possibility of windows. And yet it was a house with immense presence. Internally, it had one door on the street. And it somehow became a pattern of working, which I became very comfortable with, and which I found was a very powerful way to make architecture. So in the end, we've rarely done a facade, which is kind of an extraordinary thing. But we've done buildings of great presence. I think this division between the architect doing the exterior and the interior designer doing the interior is a huge mistake. And that architecture should be in the interior as much as on the exterior.
Inside and out.
Out, yeah. And in the end, if you take a house, if you own a house, you live in the interior 90% of the time. The exterior is a different gesture. It's a gesture to the street and to the city. But your experience as a human being is of the interior of architecture, much more than of its exterior.
I mean, Tate St. Ives in particular was a project in which you talked about engaging with the community, which seems to be the kind of very different to a lot of contemporary urban planning, which is often top down. Say, for example, the Olympic Park or Canary Wharf, which are kind of gated off areas that are often seen as alienating their communities or environments. How do you think architecture could better adapt to in order to engage and involve its communities as cities grow?
I think there's a question of scale. When people have projects of such a vast scale, they basically operate without a community because they're on empty sites or they're on cleared sites. Only smaller projects can engage with communities in that certain way. And even those large projects, by the time they're built, people move into them. It's very hard to imagine that making community. And I think it's a very difficult question about what is the role of community as part of the fabric of architecture. And architecture should be immensely adaptable. I mean, we're very interested in buildings which start as one thing and shift. And this is something in the late 20th century started to happen quite rapidly. The reuse of existing buildings with completely different purposes and people's enjoyment of the way building fabric can be deeply flexible and shift over time. I've often imagined when you see these rather dreadful big housing projects that in 20 years' time, when their lifespan is over because they have incredibly short lifespans, rather than being razed to the ground, that they could somehow be reoccupied by other architects, cannibalized and sort of reinvented into something much more organic, and communities can sort of form, kind of projecting that these might not be disasters. These could be the warehouses of the future that get re-inhabited and reworked by clever architects that haven't been born yet.
And you think that might be a more interesting phase than now?
And it's how cities become rich, how they become dense, how, why do we love old Italian cities? Well, because of the layering of habitation and the way they've been densified and reused. What we find sort of sad is the clearing of cities to build massive projects. But even look at recently the rehabilitation of Park Hill in Sheffield, which on the one wing is left in its old state and the other's been reoccupied. And how it's been reoccupied is really beautiful. The reoccupation of buildings is something I find really interesting.
That's interesting. In terms of engagement, are you a proponent of high-rise, high-density urbanization?
I'm quite happy in cities for more density. I don't have any difficulty. What I find frustrating when I first came to London in the late 80s was whole stretches of the Thames were built with 2.5-story faux Victorian housing. And these are dead areas, and those buildings should be taken down, and much denser urban forms should be in place. But they need to be careful that they create public space, that they create community space. They can't just be about luxury housing. And I think the difficulty there is who's responsible for those projects. It's no longer the city, it's no longer government. It's basically financial institutions and developers. And their model, by necessity, is about income and about wealth. And it's very hard within those models, for communities to exist. And I think government needs to change its attitude towards its involvement in projects and in making of the city. That the city needs to take responsibility for how its fabric is being built.
I mean, you mentioned when we recorded a podcast the role that regulation has to play and the challenges of regulation. How do you think, governments can adapt their legislative frameworks and so on to allow for more flexibility?
I don't think I have any answers, but I'm very
or
conscious.
What at least are the problems?
Well, I'm very conscious of the difficulty that the planning departments that we deal with, they're almost in a position where they don't generate anything. They only have the ability to react to what's given to them. So this reactive process is very limiting. And I think the whole structure of planning needs to be rethought. I think it's outdated. And it needs to be, and people have tried and are trying to change it. But as an architect, if thinking about climate change or thinking about the way we live, we are held very tightly to a set of building control regulations, and and you can't alter them, you can't challenge them. And I think as a profession, we need to challenge these much more broadly, rethink regulations and the planning system. These are big questions.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the issue of climate change, which is obviously an issue that will hugely transform cities potentially. I mean, the prospect, for example, of a city partially submerged in water would totally change the way in which we would traverse it. Would we even inhabit the space in which a city currently exists?
Or would it be just about defending the city?
Or would it be about firefighting, which is sort of the position Venice is in now?
It is.
Are architects preparing for these sorts of situations?
No. No, I think as a practicing architect, the challenges you face on a daily basis are short term. And while we might think about these bigger challenges, over time, the scope to actually address them is quite limited. I think what was interesting talking in the podcast earlier is with people who are dealing in theory and in teaching and in people who are working in research and combining research with their practice, that there are people out there thinking about these things and challenging them. I think it's quite important for architects to have research and to challenge these things, but the daily life of being an architect it's quite difficult to bring these things into focus.
So how do you embed architecture into an existing town and maintain the integrity of the original kind of architectural aesthetic?
We did it by creating a typology which is almost the inverse of a house on a garden with a front yard and a backyard. It was much more about a walled garden that had a courtyard house in it. And so what you were creating was walls between other buildings, but not really the sense that there were buildings there at all. So it's quite a discrete, and I think a really wonderful way to live in a courtyard house with a garden, but screened off from the street. And it had to be incredibly idiosyncratic. We had to take each site and almost with a certain kit of parts put together a way of inhabiting. So it needs care and time, and these are things which house builders are rarely interested in, and it needs to be done in a very careful and playful way. And so what you're trying to do is take the character of this historic place and allow it to create new housing rather than a separate place inhabiting fields that somehow new housing has to be divorced from the historic town.
So do you think as cities grow and urbanise that they have something to learn from this idea by trying to preserve their environs, the green areas that surround them?
I'm much more interested in reworking fabric and building between fabrics than demolishing.
Okay.
I mean, it's about recycling, it's about working with what you already have and adding layers of complexity and making beautiful things out of things that are found. These are things I enjoy much more than the idea of clearing land and building a sort of architect's vision of their idea of what an architecture should be.
Yeah.
Not really interested in extending my own ego through my buildings.
I mean, I think a really good example of that is Kettle's Yard, where you've kind of retained the integrity of the original architecture, but managed to expand the interior space. Can you tell me a bit about how you approach that and how that kind of relates to the views you've expressed about urbanisation?
Kettle's Yard was a wonderful process. I think the starting point for me was that Sir Leslie Martin and David Owers, who were the architects who built the original Kettle's Yard in 1970, built this masterpiece of mid-century architecture. And they added a huge piece of building onto two small cottages. And when you move through the cottages, which are ancient and very small scaled, as you move into their building, which is a big piece of architecture, you're completely unaware that you've moved from 18th century cottages into 1970s modernism.
That's true.
Because they've created consistency. So the floorboards are rough, the plaster's rough. And because the buildings are inhabited with the same stuff, lots of furniture, lots of amazing artwork, you're not conscious of this movement.
You have a sense of continuity.
Continuity is far more powerful at Kettle's Yard than contrast.
And is that something you wanted to accomplish?
Yeah, and you move so gently from the one era into another. And Jim Eade, who was the founder of Kettle's Yard, talked about Leslie Martin's architecture as developing in easy, understandable steps. And so it was something we were really interested in, creating very contemporary galleries and a way of moving through them, which continued the kind of rambling, idiosyncratic way you move through the existing building and kept the looseness of Kettle's Yard. And some of its material palette moves from the old into the new, and then it slowly changed. So that it's very hard to see a point at which Leslie Martin's work ends and our work begins. There's a lot of overlap. We allowed that overlap to take place. And the character of Kettle's Yard is somehow kept, even though, again, the scale is shifted. That was very important to me. And the fact that it all happens behind a retained Victorian facade makes it an incredibly discreet piece of architecture. And these are all things that we enjoy in our work.
And you've lived in London, obviously, for quite a long time.
Yeah, for 30 years.
For 30 years. That's longer than me. But I wondered if there were any particular examples of areas or urban projects that you particularly admire, if not the iconic architecture that we're seeing pop up in the city, which presumably isn't what you would opt for.
It's been very interesting because I live just around the corner at the beginning of Old Street, and now I work at the far end of Shoreditch, and I cycle and walk. And when we first arrived, and I moved into the building on the corner of Old Street in '99, there were derelict buildings everywhere, there were empty sites everywhere. The city was, in a way, seriously underpopulated, particularly east. So I've watched this transformation, and while people are disparaging, and with good reason, about the cost of real estate and the inability of most people under 40 to buy and to do what I was able to do as a young person in London, I totally understand this, and it's a huge problem. But at the same time, the way the city, between just walking from where I live to where I work, how buildings are being inserted, and some of them very finely, into the fabric of the city, buildings added on top. You know, the Tompkin Liu housing on top of a warehouse block that I go past, the way, again, like the way Tompkin Liu changed the whole of Old Street with their urban furniture. There are many instances where I find really beautiful and careful incisions into the city have been made.
So in East London in particular?
In East London.
What about an area like Stratford?
Well, I think
or where the Olympic Park has been created?
Well, I thought the Olympic Park was a desolate piece of land. It's a vast piece of land. Mm-hmm. And I think the idea of the Olympics having a legacy was an incredibly important moment, because Olympics before that had been really problematic. Mm-hmm. The quality of the housing, I think, is problematic there. But and the way it's become a bit of an island, a bit of a sort of gated, almost like a gated community in Stratford. You don't feel the connection to the rest of Stratford that it could have. But I think the city should have been much more involved in making connections and allowing the old part of Stratford to be regenerated through this process. It feels like they're now two worlds.
And we had a London special issue to coincide with London Design Festival a couple of months ago, and we included a feature about, a lot of it was about East London, but how the changes in the property situation are inevitably meaning young people can't afford property, but also that creativity can no longer thrive here. Have you seen a sort of negative shift in the sense of creativity being driven out?
Yes, I think this is a problem. It's a problem that's very hard to address. There are certain creative industries, particularly artists and young artists, who require almost free accommodation. They require derelict spaces. And so a city which had a lot of derelict spaces supported a really thriving artist community. And on the whole, I think most artists have had to leave and go to Dusseldorf and Berlin, and cities which still have derelict outer regions, but a sort of thriving center. And London's almost been gentrified to the point where these communities are having to leave. I'm very conscious that when I was a young architect and I worked in David Chipfield's office in the 80s and 90s, it was incredibly difficult, but my partner and I managed to buy a house that was derelict, completely derelict.
In East London?
In Stoke Newington.
Oh, okay.
And then sold that as this wave of house prices soaring happened, and then buy a derelict warehouse just here. And the building that we bought in 1999 had not been occupied by anyone since the war.
Oh my goodness.
So that's really hard for
you wouldn't even find a property like that now.
And that's right here in the next block. No one had bothered to occupy this building in any way. And I look at the people in my office who are the age I was, and there are no opportunities for that to happen again. Now, we thought we were doing an extraordinarily dangerous thing, buying this buildings for huge amounts of money, what seemed way beyond our scope. In retrospect, it was a tiny amount of money, and it was an incredibly sensible thing to do. But there just aren't opportunities like that for young people, and I think this is really discouraging. And if it leads to a revolution, I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, one can only hope.
A certain kind of revolution.
A certain kind of revolution.
Yeah.
Not the sort that's occurring currently.
No.
To finish, I mean, you've talked about some of the clearly challenges that cities are facing in terms of gentrification and rising house prices, but also ways in which architects can make positive interventions in urbanizing by using existing architecture wisely and putting, I guess, the use of space before their own egos, which I thought was a really perceptive and interesting way of looking at things. But overall, how do you feel about the future of cities?
Well, I think I'm intrinsically optimistic, and I think the swing of politics to the right and how divisive politics have become and how divided communities have become, of course, is a worry. But I think there's a moment when it will swing back, And I think this is just how politics has been for the last few hundred years. I have a intrinsic optimism about humanity and about people's ability to protect and create their own environment, and people's awareness of their environment and what architecture can be is much more heightened than it was when I arrived in Britain in '88. The general public has a much greater understanding of what they can achieve and what they have, what has value for them, I think. And yes, these are huge challenges, particularly economically, but I think people are clever and they will find ways, and young people will, hopefully another generation of architects will carry on finding ways to make better cities, and cities which are great to live in.
That's great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Icon Minds. I hope that you'll join us next time when we'll be talking about the future of transport. Thank you.